The taxi idled at the corner of Invalidenstrasse and Chausseestrasse in West Berlin, engine ticking in the cold drizzle of November 17, 1978, at 11:47 p.m. The driver, a balding man in his mid-40s, wearing a wool peacoat and wire-rimmed glasses, watched the neon sign of a bar called Der Adler flicker across the wet pavement. A figure stumbled out. American, mid-30s, navy overcoat unbuttoned, tie askew, briefcase swinging. He waved with the exaggerated confidence of someone who'd had 6 drinks too many. The driver leaned over and opened the rear door. The man collapsed into the seat, exhaling bourbon and exhaustion. Dalton, he slurred in English. American sector, Clay Alley. The driver nodded, shifted into gear, and pulled into the empty street. What the passenger didn't know, what he couldn't have known in his state, was that the man behind the wheel was Captain Yuri Mikhailovich Volkov, KGB Second Chief Directorate, assigned to the Berlin Residentura under diplomatic cover as a trade liaison. And what Volkov didn't expect was that over the next 32 minutes, this drunk American would hand him one of the most damaging intelligence breaches of the late Cold War without a single question asked. To understand how a senior CIA officer ended up confessing operational secrets to a Soviet intelligence officer in the back of a taxi, you have to go back to the ecosystem of West Berlin in the late 1970s, a city that was simultaneously a geopolitical flashpoint, an espionage capital, and a pressure cooker for anyone working in the clandestine services. By 1978, Berlin was divided not just by the wall, but by overlapping networks of surveillance, recruitment, and counter-recruitment. The CIA's Berlin Operations Base, known internally as BOB, ran agents in the East, monitored Soviet military communications, and coordinated with West German intelligence. The KGB's Berlin Residentura did the same in reverse, with additional mandates to penetrate NATO, track dissidents, and recruit Western officials. Both sides employed every available vector: blackmail, ideology, money, sex, and, crucially, human error. West Berlin's bar culture was a hunting ground. Officers from both sides frequented the same establishments, sometimes knowingly, often not. Alcohol was both social lubricant and operational hazard. The CIA's own internal security protocols warned against uncontrolled environments, but enforcement was inconsistent. Officers worked long hours under intense stress, managing agents whose lives depended on operational security, and the temptation to decompress in an anonymous dive bar was powerful. The KGB understood this. Volkov's assignment wasn't glamorous. He drove a taxi part-time as a cover mechanism, a role that allowed him to move freely through West Berlin, observe patterns, and occasionally pick up targets of opportunity. Most nights yielded nothing. But on November 17, 1978, his luck changed. The passenger's name was Robert Edward Dalton. He was 34 years old, a graduate of Yale and the Army's intelligence school at Fort Huachuca, and had been with the CIA since 1969. His official cover was as a political officer at the U.S. mission in West Berlin, but his actual role was as a case officer in Bob's Soviet division, responsible for handling 2 active agents inside East German ministries and coordinating dead drops near the border. Dalton was considered competent, but not exceptional. His personnel file noted solid operational discipline, but also occasional lapses in judgment under stress. He had been in Berlin for 18 months. His marriage was deteriorating. His wife had returned to Virginia 3 months earlier with their daughter, citing the strain of the posting. Dalton had stayed behind, alone in a small apartment in Dahlem, working 12-hour days and spending his evenings in bars along Kurfürstendamm. On the night of November 17th, he had been drinking at Der Adler since 8 p.m., waiting for a contact who never showed. By the time he left, he was profoundly intoxicated and emotionally unraveled. Volkov, for his part, was a methodical operator. Born in Leningrad in 1933, he had joined the KGB in 1956 after military service and had spent 2 decades in counterintelligence and foreign operations. His German was fluent, his English serviceable, and his instincts sharp. He had been driving the taxi route through West Berlin's bar districts 3 nights a week for 6 months, a pattern designed to appear routine while maximizing exposure to potential intelligence opportunities. He carried no recording devices, too risky if searched, but he had been trained in mnemonic techniques to retain conversations verbatim. When Dalton got into the taxi, Volkov immediately noted the American accent, the quality of the overcoat, the briefcase, and the level of intoxication. He made a calculated decision. Engage carefully, let the passenger talk, and see what emerged. The first 5 minutes of the ride were unremarkable. Dalton gave directions, complained about the rain, and stared out the window. Then, unprompted, he began to talk. "You know what the problem is?" he said, his voice thick. "The problem is nobody tells you the truth. Not your wife, not your boss, not the people you're supposed to trust." Volkov made a neutral sound of acknowledgement, eyes on the road. "You do everything right," Dalton continued, "and it doesn't matter. You follow the protocols, you keep the secrets, and it all falls apart anyway." Volkov asked, in accented English, "Bad day at work?" It was a simple question, the kind a taxi driver might ask. Dalton laughed bitterly. "Bad year," then he said, "You ever work for the government?" Volkov said, "In Soviet Union, everyone worked for government." Dalton found this funny. "Yeah, well, in America, the government works for itself." What happened next was a cascade. Dalton, seeking validation or catharsis or simply the relief of unburdening, began to describe his work in vague terms: intelligence, operations, the wall. Volkov asked gentle follow-up questions, framed as curiosity rather than interrogation. "What kind of operations?" Dalton hesitated, then said, "The kind where you meet people in the dark and hope they don't get caught." Volkov nodded. "Dangerous work." Dalton agreed, especially when the people you're meeting are on the other side of the wall. This was the first concrete detail. Dalton was running agents in East Berlin. Volkov filed it away and kept driving. By the time they crossed into Dahlem, Dalton had provided a fragmentary but damaging sketch of his operational portfolio. He mentioned 2 agents by cryptonym, Compass and Lantern, without realizing he had done so. He described a dead drop location near Treptower Park, complaining that it was too exposed and that his superiors had ignored his concerns. He referenced a scheduled meeting on November 21st, 4 days away, and expressed anxiety that the agent might be under surveillance. He did not provide names, addresses, or full operational details, but he provided enough that a trained intelligence officer could begin to construct a target list. Volkov's mind worked rapidly, committing each detail to memory, cross-referencing it against known CIA patterns and KGB files. When they arrived at Dalton's apartment building on Clay Alley, Volkov pulled to the curb and turned off the meter. Dalton fumbled for his wallet, handed over a 20-mark note, and waved off the change. "Keep it," he said. "You're a good listener." Volkov thanked him and watched as Dalton staggered toward the entrance, briefcase dragging. Then Volkov drove 3 blocks, parked in a side street, and spent the next hour reconstructing the conversation in a pocket notebook, writing in Russian shorthand. He noted the cryptonyms, the dead drop location, the meeting date, and Dalton's emotional state. At 1:15 a.m., he returned to the Soviet sector, passed through Checkpoint Charlie using his diplomatic credentials, and drove directly to the KGB Residentura on Normanenstrasse. By 2 a.m., his report was on the desk of Colonel Anatoly Kiriev, head of the 2nd Chief Directorate's Berlin operations. Kiriev read the report twice, then convened an emergency meeting with his deputy, and 2 senior case officers. The question was immediate. How much of this was actionable, and how much was drunken rambling? The cryptonyms Compass and Lantern did not appear in KGB files, which suggested they were either new recruitments or compartmented so tightly that even the KGB's penetration of Western intelligence hadn't surfaced them. The dead drop location at Treptower Park was plausible. It was a known area for clandestine activity, with enough foot traffic to provide cover, but enough green space for concealment. The meeting date of November 21st gave them 4 days to act. Kireev made the decision to pursue verification. He ordered surveillance on the Treptower Park area starting November 18th, with instructions to identify any individual exhibiting counter-surveillance behavior or conducting a dead drop. He also ordered a review of recent CIA personnel movements in Berlin to identify likely case officers matching Dalton's profile. The surveillance operation began at dawn on November 18th. KGB watchers, working in rotating shifts, monitored the park and surrounding streets. On November 20th, they observed a man in his late 50s, East German by appearance, enter the park at 6:30 a.m., walk a looping route, and pause near a specific bench to tie his shoe. A classic signal. The watchers photographed him and ran the images through Stasi files. He was identified as Günther Holzmann, a mid-level official in the East German Ministry of Trade, with access to economic planning documents and occasional contact with Soviet advisors. His file noted no prior intelligence connections, but his behavior matched the profile of a controlled agent. The KGB now had a target. On November 21st, the scheduled meeting date, the KGB set a trap. At 5 a.m., Holzmann was arrested at his apartment by Stasi officers acting on KGB orders. He was taken to a Ministry for State Security facility in Hohenschönhausen and interrogated for 14 hours. Initially, he denied everything. But when confronted with surveillance photographs and the suggestion that his contact had already been compromised, he broke. He confirmed that he had been recruited by the CIA 6 months earlier, that his cryptonym was Compass, and that his handler was an American case officer who met him at irregular intervals near the wall. He provided details of dead drops, signal sites, and the intelligence he had passed, economic reports, internal ministry communications, and assessments of Soviet-East German relations. He did not know his handler's real name, only a cover identity, but his description matched Dalton. The KGB now faced a strategic choice. They could arrest Dalton, creating a diplomatic incident and a propaganda victory, or they could exploit the breach for counterintelligence purposes. Kireev recommended the latter. Holzmann was turned into a double agent, fed controlled information, and used to monitor CIA operations. Dalton, meanwhile, remained unaware that his drunken confession had triggered a cascade. The KGB did not immediately move against him, calculating that his continued activity might reveal additional agents or operational methods, but they flagged him for long-term surveillance and began building a dossier. Dalton's unraveling continued. On November 23rd, 2 days after Holzmann's arrest, Dalton attempted to make contact with Compass using an emergency signal protocol. When no response came, he reported the missed contact to his superiors at BIOB, attributing it to possible illness or logistical delay. He did not suspect compromise. Over the following weeks, he grew increasingly anxious, drinking more heavily, and making erratic decisions. On December 9th, he failed to show up for a scheduled meeting with a second agent, Lantern, who was later identified as a low-level clerk in the East German Interior Ministry. Lantern, spooked by the missed meeting and sensing danger, ceased all contact and went to ground. The CIA's Berlin station began an internal review, trying to determine whether the operational failures were coincidental or indicative of a broader problem. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In early January 1979, a KGB defector in place in Moscow, a GRU officer codenamed Trigon, passed information to the CIA indicating that the KGB had recently compromised a Western intelligence officer in Berlin through casual contact. The details were vague, but the timing aligned with Dalton's operational failures. The CIA's counterintelligence division launched a damage assessment, interviewing Dalton and reviewing his activities. Dalton, by now aware that something had gone wrong, admitted to heavy drinking and possible indiscretions, but could not recall specifics. He mentioned the taxi ride on November 17th, but dismissed it as irrelevant. "I was drunk. I probably complained about work, nothing serious." The CIA's investigators were not convinced. They polygraphed Dalton in February 1979. The results were inconclusive, but raised red flags around questions about unauthorized disclosures. Dalton was placed on administrative leave and recalled to Langley for further debriefing. Over the course of 3 weeks, he was questioned repeatedly about his contacts, his drinking, and his emotional state. Slowly, fragments of the taxi conversation surfaced in his memory. Vague recollections of talking about agents and meetings, though he insisted he had not provided names or locations. The CIA's assessment concluded that Dalton had likely compromised operational details while intoxicated, though the full extent of the damage could not be determined. Dalton was terminated from the CIA in April 1979, his security clearance revoked. He was not prosecuted. There was insufficient evidence of intentional espionage, and a trial would have exposed operational details the CIA preferred to keep classified. Instead, he was quietly separated from the service and returned to the United States. He found work as a consultant for a defense contractor, a position that required no clearance, and lived out the remainder of his career in obscurity. He died in 2003, never publicly acknowledging the Berlin incident. His personnel file, partially declassified in 2012, contains a single notation. Subject's operational security failures in Berlin resulted in compromise of at least one controlled agent and possible exposure of additional assets. Termination recommended. Holtzman, the compromised agent, was executed by the Stasi in March 1980 after serving as a double agent for 14 months. The KGB had extracted everything he knew, then deemed him a liability. His family was told he had died in a car accident. Lantern, the second agent, was never identified by the KGB and successfully exfiltrated to the West in 1983, where he was resettled under a new identity. The dead drop at Treptower Park was abandoned by both sides and eventually became a tourist site after the wall fell. Volkov, the taxi driver, was quietly decorated by the KGB for his role in the operation. He received the Order of the Red Star in a closed ceremony and was promoted to major. He continued his work in Berlin until 1985, when he was reassigned to Moscow. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, he retired and wrote a memoir that was published in Russian in 1998. In it, he described the Dalton encounter in detail, noting, "It was not skill that won the night, but the Americans' despair. He wanted to be heard, and I simply listened." The memoir was never translated into English, and Volkov died in 2007. The CIA's internal review of the Dalton case led to a tightening of security protocols around alcohol consumption and off-duty behavior for officers in high-threat environments. A classified memo circulated in 1980 emphasized the catastrophic potential of uncontrolled social interactions and mandated that officers in Berlin and other sensitive posts undergo quarterly psychological evaluations. The memo cited the Dalton case as a cautionary example, though it did not name him directly. What remains unknown is the full scope of what Dalton revealed. The KGB's files on the incident, if they still exist, have not been declassified. Volkov's memoir provides his perspective, but it is unclear whether he embellished or omitted details for operational security or personal reasons. The CIA's damage assessment, partially released under FOIA requests, redacts key sections, including the identities of other agents who may have been at risk. Historians and intelligence analysts have speculated that Dalton's disclosures may have contributed to the compromise of additional CIA operations in East Germany during the late 1970s, but no definitive evidence has emerged. The Dalton case is a study in the intersection of human frailty and systemic vulnerability. It was not a grand betrayal driven by ideology or greed, but a moment of weakness. A drunk man unburdening himself to a stranger who happened to be an enemy. It illustrates the Cold War's relentless pressure on individuals operating in the shadows, where the margin for error was non-existent and the consequences of failure were measured in lives. It also reveals the opportunistic nature of intelligence work, where success often depended not on elaborate schemes, but on being in the right place at the right time, ready to exploit a fleeting advantage. The taxi ride on Invalidenstrasse lasted 32 minutes. In that brief window, a career was destroyed, an agent was condemned, and a small but significant intelligence victory was won. The Cold War was full of such moments, unremarkable on the surface, catastrophic in their consequences. Dalton's story is a reminder that the most dangerous disclosures are often the ones that feel inconsequential at the time, spoken in the back of a taxi on a rainy night, to a listener who never forgot a word. In the end, the question that haunts the Dalton case is not what he said, but what he didn't realize he was saying. Intelligence officers are trained to compartmentalize, to guard secrets even under duress, but alcohol and isolation erode those defenses. Dalton believed he was venting to a nobody, a taxi driver who would forget him by morning. He was wrong. The Cold War's lesson, repeated in countless variations, is that there are no nobodies in a city like Berlin, no safe confessions, no moments off the record. Every word is a potential weapon, and every stranger is a potential adversary. The operational mechanics of the Dalton Compromise reveal the asymmetry of Cold War intelligence work. The KGB did not need to recruit Dalton, blackmail him, or even approach him. They simply needed to be present, patient, and prepared to exploit human error. Volkov's taxi was not a targeted operation, but a passive collection platform, a net cast wide in the hope of catching something valuable. The fact that it worked speaks to the scale and persistence of Soviet intelligence efforts in Berlin, where hundreds of officers and agents operated in overlapping networks, each one a potential point of contact with the enemy. The CIA's failure in the Dalton case was not primarily operational, but cultural. The agency's emphasis on individual initiative and operational autonomy, while effective in many contexts, created blind spots around personal conduct and psychological resilience. Dalton was not monitored closely enough, his drinking was not flagged as a security risk, and his emotional deterioration went unaddressed until it was too late. The lesson, absorbed slowly and incompletely, was that intelligence work is not just about recruiting agents and stealing secrets, but about managing the human beings who do that work, their stress, their isolation, their vulnerabilities. The broader implications of the Dalton case extend beyond Berlin and beyond the Cold War. It is a case study in the limits of training and discipline when confronted with personal crisis. It demonstrates that security protocols, no matter how rigorous, cannot fully account for the unpredictability of human behavior under strain. And it underscores the enduring truth that in intelligence work, the most dangerous enemy is often not the adversary across the border, but the weakness within. Declassified documents from the 1980s and 1990s reveal that the CIA conducted multiple internal studies on alcohol-related security incidents in the wake of the Dalton case. These studies identified dozens of similar cases, officers who had disclosed classified information while intoxicated, though few with consequences as severe as Dalton's. The studies recommended stricter controls on alcohol consumption, mandatory counseling for officers showing signs of stress, and enhanced counterintelligence training focused on recognizing and resisting elicitation attempts in social settings. Some of these recommendations were implemented. Others were resisted as impractical or intrusive. The human cost of the Dalton case is difficult to quantify. Holtzman, the executed agent, left behind a wife and 2 children who were subjected to Stasi surveillance and social ostracism for years after his death. Lantern, the agent who escaped, lived under an assumed identity for the rest of his life, never able to return to his homeland or contact his family. Dalton himself, though he avoided prison, spent the last 2 decades of his life in a kind of internal exile, aware that he had failed catastrophically, but unable to fully articulate or atone for that failure. The ripple effects extended to the families, colleagues, and institutions touched by the case, each bearing a fragment of the damage. The Dalton case also highlights the role of chance in intelligence work. If Dalton had taken a different taxi, or if Volkov had been off-duty that night, or if Dalton had been slightly less drunk or slightly more cautious, the entire chain of events would have unfolded differently. Intelligence history is full of such contingencies, moments where the outcome hinged on a single decision, a random encounter, a stroke of luck. The Dalton case is a reminder that for all the planning, training, and resources invested in espionage, the outcome often depends on factors beyond anyone's control. What the Dalton case reveals about the Cold War itself is the pervasive atmosphere of suspicion and surveillance that defined the era. In Berlin, every interaction was potentially an intelligence operation, every stranger a possible agent. This created a climate of paranoia that affected not just intelligence officers, but ordinary citizens who learned to watch their words, avoid certain topics, and trust no one completely. The wall was the most visible symbol of this division, but the invisible walls of fear, secrecy, and mistrust were just as real and just as damaging. The question of what Dalton actually said in the taxi and what Volkov actually reported remains partially unresolved. Volkov's memoir provides one account, but it was written nearly 2 decades after the fact and may have been shaped by memory, self-interest, or Soviet censorship. The CIA's files provide another account, but they are incomplete and heavily redacted. The truth likely lies somewhere between the two, a fragmentary and contested narrative that will never be fully reconstructed. This ambiguity is characteristic of Cold War intelligence history, where much of what happened remains classified, disputed, or lost. The legacy of the Dalton case persists in contemporary intelligence training and policy. It is cited in CIA case studies on operational security, used as a cautionary tale in courses on counterintelligence, and referenced in debates about the psychological support provided to officers in high-stress environments. It has become a shorthand for the dangers of complacency, isolation, and uncontrolled behavior. A reminder that even the most mundane lapse can have strategic consequences. In the final analysis, the Dalton case is a story about the collision of personal failure and institutional vulnerability, set against the backdrop of a global conflict that demanded perfection from imperfect human beings. It is a story without heroes, only victims and survivors, and it offers no easy lessons beyond the recognition that in the world of espionage, there are no small mistakes, no private conversations, and no second chances. The taxi ride on Invalidenstrasse was a 32-minute window into the fragility of secrets and the cost of letting one's guard down, even for a moment, in a city where the enemy was always listening.